So yes, the Mavic 3 has finally launched. Now, if you've been following this, in the end, it has felt a bit like an anticlimax simply because of the amount of information that was shared up front. However, it is finally out there, we have the reviews, and users are getting their hands on this new drone from DJI today. Now, I don't have a Mavic 3 because I wasn't sent one. I've not been able to get my hands on one yet. However, I do just want to share with you some thoughts that I do have on this new drone from DJI. Now, this isn't an anti-DJI or you shouldn't buy this drone video or you should buy this drone. I do though want to share with you some, not concerns, but thoughts that I have on where this drone fits into people's potential workflow, being someone who uses drones and cameras extensively. For instance, I have owned pretty much every Phantom. I've had every Mavic up till now, including the Mavic 2 Pro here. I've had the Inspire 1 and Inspire 2 with the X5S that you can see in the background. And I also use a number of both micro four thirds and full frame cameras. For instance, I own the G9 that I'm recording this on now, the GH5, which I also use extensively, and the new full frame Lumix S5. So what I want to do is talk through some points on this new drone I do think you need to be aware of and take into consideration before you run out and spend either nearly £2,000 or $2,000 on the base model, or well over £3,000 or $4,000 in the US. Now, I'm going to talk about some very specific subjects. I'm not going to jump into too much technical detail on the specs, but it's just stuff that I feel you should take into account before jumping in. So let's get on with it and let's talk about the camera first of all. So the first thing to talk about is this new camera. Now, as originally leaked, it is a dual sensor camera with the new 4/3 size sensor with the 25mm equivalent lens. And you've then got a telephoto 12 megapixel camera above it for zoomed in telephoto style use. Now, this zoomed in one isn't a zoom model, it is a fixed telephoto lens with a digital zoom and crop option, and it's using a mix of cropping in on the sensor and digital zoom to give you that extra magnification. Now, that is pretty much where I'm going to leave it with regards to this top camera, because frankly, everything I've seen on it so far has been quite disappointing, and whilst I haven't seen it for myself, I really don't fully understand why that sensor is even there. I would have much preferred to have had a single camera, and at the moment I'm personally not seeing a massive use case for this out of a very small subset of users, and I don't really fully understand why DJI went to such lengths to engineer this complex dual camera setup that not many people are actually going to want to use. Now, the real interesting stuff, though, is around the 4/3 sensor, because it is the largest sensor that we've ever had on a Mavic, and it is the same size sensor as not only the X5 and the X5S for the Inspire 2, but cameras like the GH5 and the G9 that I'm recording this on. Now, the 4/3 sensor and micro 4/3 system is one that is loved by many people who use it. One of the big benefits of the micro 4/3 system on these cameras, for instance, is the compact sizes of the lens, and the fact that it does have a 2x crop factor means you can actually get some really nice long telephoto lenses without all of that large size like you do see on other cameras. On the X5S, one of the big benefits of having that 4/3 system was the fact that you could have interchangeable lenses. DJI originally shipped it with the 15mm, but you could go up to 45mm no problem, allowing you to get some really nice tight-in shots without getting the drone too close. Now, DJI have shipped this new Mavic with a roughly 25mm equivalent, and this sort of, I don't fully understand where they were thinking on this one either, because it's a bit tight for full out and out landscape photography with a drone, but it's not tight enough for people who want to do things like wedding photography or want to get in close with people, because you're going to have to get that drone right up close to be able to get that decent image. Now, this new sensor is 20 megapixels, just like the 20 megapixel sensor that we had on the Mavic 2 Pro. It is bigger, but the actual pixel count is the same, which means the real difference is the pixels on this new sensor are going to be larger and they're going to gather more light. In normal daylight conditions, it's not going to make much of a difference. However, in dark conditions, there's no question that this new sensor should see an improvement for early evening or even nighttime use. I will say I am a bit worried around some of the comments I have seen from people online saying things like this is a replacement for the Inspire 2 or it's going to be as good. And for the majority of users, the stills output and video on the standard model Mavic 3 at least is going to look very much the same as the Mavic 2 Pro. The sensor that DJI fitted on this was a very good Sony sensor, and there are good cameras out there such as the RX100 from Sony that also use these 1-inch sensors, and it really is no limiting factor on the capability of these drone cameras. The biggest issue on the Mavic 2 was not the sensor itself, but the processing, and it was the fact that it was limited in that HQ mode to subsampling and that you weren't able to get the best benefit from it. Whilst it is great to see a larger sensor on the Mavic 3, do take into account for the standard model, the difference between the Mavic 2 Pro and the new Mavic 3 is going to be very, very minimal. The Cine model that does have built-in ProRes on the SSD will be able to take full advantage of it, but unless you're going to get that model, you may find such a marginal difference between the two, it's probably not worth the cost. For instance, as I've said, I have the GH5, the G9 and the S5, and the sensor on this camera is substantially larger than on these other two. However, that doesn't automatically mean it's got better image quality, it just allows me to do different things with it. One of the big ones being better low light photography, but that does come at the cost of weight and size, as you can see as I hold those two up here. What we don't really understand yet is what DJI has done with the glass on the Mavic 3 for that 25mm lens, and that could be a major limiting factor on how well that new sensor performs, because at the end of the day, glass is as important as the sensor itself, and having a great sensor with poor quality glass or restrictive glass is always going to restrict the capabilities of the camera. Now, depending on what you intend to do with it will depend on what model you should choose. We do have two, so we have the standard model, which works with a standard SD card, records on either H.264 or H.265, which can do either 200 megabits in H.264 or 130 megabits in H.265. Now, as I've said, to get the best from this sensor, you're really going to want that ProRes model, which allows for ProRes HQ, and that should allow you to record about half an hour of footage on board the 1 terabyte SSD. But again, you are paying a heavy price for that model, and it isn't something that you're getting on the standard one. Just some observations on some of the footage that I have seen from the standard model Mavic 3. It is already being constrained by the codec. There are a number of reviews showing some of the issues on that 4/3 sensor recording when recording in H.264, and I have seen very limited output from H.265 and not enough for me to really make a full judgment on. But at the end of the day, it's not going to give you a dramatic difference than you're getting on this already. And what you'll have to weigh up is, if you're going to upgrade from this, what is your reasons and why are you doing it? At the end of the day, what I would say is this: from a camera point of view, this sensor, whilst being larger, is not going to be night and day, and don't get fooled into thinking this is going to dramatically improve your photography. As I've already said, the lens focal length isn't ideal for some applications or others, but for some people it will be fine for general drone use. But pros aren't going to want to be flying this up and close at a wedding with a 25mm lens whilst the bride and the groom are walking out of the church just to get the right shot. And the Inspire 2 with, say, a 45mm lens is always going to be the better option. I do find the camera on the Mavic 3 a bit of a contradiction overall. I'm not saying it's bad, and I'm not saying it isn't going to deliver outstanding results, but there is so much more that could have been done with a 1-inch sensor and not bothered upgrading it. But it is what it is. It's what we've got. So we're going to have to wait and see. But as I've already said, weigh up what you need before jumping out and buying it. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is the remote controllers, because this has been the more controversial side of the launch. As I've mentioned, the Mavic 3 is available in 2 versions, a standard and a Cine. There is a Fly More pack in the middle of these two, which is a standard model that includes a couple of extra batteries and a charge hub, but it is the same standard model and uses the same remote. Now, the standard version comes with the DJI RC-N1, which is the same remote that we had with the Air 2S. It is a big shame to see the original Mavic remote now finally disappear, because personally I really like this design and I would have preferred to have had one with at least a screen built in like we did on this one. And it's hard not to think DJI have cheaped out a little bit on the standard model simply by reusing an existing one and not developing something like they did on the Mavic 2. Cine users, though, get an upgrade and they get what is now known as the DJI RC Pro. This is a new updated version of the DJI Smart Controller designed to be used with the Mavic 3. Now, to be clear, the new RC Pro only works with the Mavic 3, and the original DJI Smart Controller does not work with the Mavic 3 either. This new remote has no backwards capabilities, and the old one will work with up to the Air 2S, but it will not work with the new Mavic 3. Now, the biggest controversial thing around these new remotes has been not only the pricing, because if you wanted to get this new remote on its own in the UK, I think it's nearly £900, and in the US, it's over $1,000. But it's also the talk and the information around the wireless system, because DJI have started to confuse things with all of their product naming around Ocusync. If you don't know what Ocusync is, it's the wireless communication protocol that goes between the drone and the remote and the drone for control and video. We first saw Ocusync on the Mavic Pro, and that was version 1, and that was an improvement over the original Lightbridge system that we had on, for instance, the Inspire 1 and 2. Really, the big difference between Lightbridge that we had before and Ocusync is that Ocusync is based on an SDR and it uses a custom DJI ASIC. DJI have developed Ocusync over the years. We had Ocusync 1 on the Mavic Pro, then Ocusync 2 on the Mavic 2 series, and now we have Ocusync 3 on the Air 2S and 3 Plus on the Mavic 3. Now, there is a bit of difference between these systems, and there is a complete mess of compatibility. For instance, the original Smart Controller will actually work on Ocusync 2 and Ocusync 3, but the new DJI RC Pro will work on Ocusync 3 Plus, but not Ocusync 3 and Ocusync 2. Also, DJI haven't fully explained the differences, but I am going to put a chart up on the screen to explain to you what the fundamental differences are between these different versions of Ocusync. Now, to just try and explain this mess that it is Ocusync, the Mavic 3 is labelled as coming with O3 Plus, which is the latest version of Ocusync, which allows up to 15 kilometers range, a live feed of either 1080p 30 or 1080p 60, down to 120 milliseconds latency, and works with both the new RC Pro and the RC-N1. The real odd thing around this is whilst the RC Pro is Ocusync 3, the RC-N1 is actually Ocusync 2. If you take a look at the specs, the main differences is data rates. So for instance, on the Mavic 3, the RC Pro can have a data rate of up to 15 megabits a second, whereas the standard RC, which is the RCN1 in Ocusync 2 mode, will only allow up to 5 megabits a second. Whilst the resolution is the same, it's the amount of data that's being transferred that is restricted, and what you would find is the live view quality on the RC Pro would just look much better than on the standard remote. The real strange bit to all of this, though, is that the Mavic 3 will support Ocusync 2 remotes, such as the RCN1, but doesn't work with the Ocusync 2 smart controller, because the smart controller is an Ocusync 2 remote and works with other Ocusync 2 drones, including the Mavic 2 Pro series. Technically, the fact that the Mavic 3 supports an Ocusync 2 remote, such as the RCN1, should mean it should also work with this remote as well, yet DJI say the only remote controls that are compatible are the RCN1 or the RC Pro. Now, there are many different flavors of Ocusync, and I'm going to put a chart up on the screen just to show you what the differences are. The biggest ones are resolutions and data rates of the systems. For instance, the Ocusync 3 on the A2S supports 1080p 30, but is limited to 12 megabits a second. Then you have the different versions of Ocusync, including the FPV version, which has much higher data rates, up to 50 megabits a second, but has a much lower resolution. And that is how it's able to get the lower latency, but better overall performance on latency compared to the other one as a result of the lower resolution. The whole remote thing is confusing, and frankly, it would be good if DJI could clear this all up for people, and it's a massive shame those people who have spent £600-700 or dollars on a smart controller in the last 2 years are basically turning it into e-waste, and it's not going to be able to be used with their new drone that they may want to purchase. Everyone would much rather see DJI make these remotes compatible because on paper they are. They say themselves the RCN1 is Ocusync 2, so why doesn't the smart controller work? Obviously, things could change in the future and we will have to see, but the chances are what we see today is going to be how it is moving forward. Just before we move on from remotes, I want to talk about the app situation, because this is also as confusing as the remotes themselves. The Mavic 3 is using the Fly App rather than Go 4. Now, the Fly App was originally released as a cut-down app for use on DJI's budget aircraft models. It does not have many of the advanced controls or camera features that you find in Go 4. However, DJI have decided to launch the Mavic 3 with the Fly App, yet it doesn't have half of the features and capabilities that it needs to get the best from the drone. For me, it is rather a strange move, and hopefully it's simply a sign that DJI intends to move all of their aircraft over to Fly and port all of that functionality over. But just like the fact that they've released the drone with some of the functionality missing, the app is exactly the same. And for a pro drone with pro features, it seems bizarre to launch it with an app that doesn't let you use them. We're going to have to wait and see how this side of things develops, but here and now, the Fly App is heavily limited compared to Go 4 in both the options that you can control the drones for and around what camera controls you've got available for that lovely new camera as well. The next thing I want to quickly talk about is SDK, because you need to understand that there is no SDK support on the new Mavic 3 at this time and no timescale when that will happen. When it launched, it didn't even come with the smart shots, and that is something I will talk about at the end of the video, but you should understand that that means DJI's priorities are somewhat elsewhere, and you may not see SDK support for this drone for quite some time. Whilst usually DJI does bring it in the end, do take into account if you need to use this drone with any other apps that are not the DJI Fly app, you may be limited for quite some time. The next thing I just want to talk about is charging and battery costs. Now, if you haven't spotted it, the Mavic 3 charges differently to previous models. Whereas in the past, we had a mains adapter which had a custom end that would plug into the battery, and you could then have an additional charge hub. The Mavic 3, though, is charged via USB-C, and whilst that brings some really big benefits for charging out and about, you do now have to charge the battery in the aircraft on the standard model. There is no custom end on the charger, and you simply need to put the battery into the aircraft and then plug the charger into the aircraft, and that will charge it in situ. If you did want to charge externally, you can get a charge hub from DJI, which again does have the USB-C input. However, that isn't included with the standard kit, and you do need to take that into account as part of your workflow when using the aircraft, because if you're anything like me, I used to have a charger in a dedicated place and my aircraft would stay in the bag, whereas now you are going to be charging via that. Another big shock around the Mavic 3 was the price of the batteries. Yes, they are extremely expensive and up there with the TB50 series from DJI for the Inspire. Now, the battery life on this drone does appear to be outstanding, so what you are getting is around 40 minutes real-world use, but that does come at a high cost, and you do need to take that into account when buying this drone. Anyone who has bought an Inspire 2 that wasn't for professional use will know the pain of paying £170 a battery, so do take that into account before you make your overall purchase decisions. One last comment I just want to make on that battery as well is the charge time. When charging in the aircraft, I've read it's around 95 minutes. So do again take that into account, and is something you want to bear in mind depending on how many batteries you're going to get. And the reality is, if you're going to get more than one, you're going to need to get that charge hub. Now, just before I jump into my final thoughts on this, I do want to talk about workflow, and specifically the workflow on the Cine model. Now, as I've mentioned, the standard model records in either H.264 or H.265 to standard SD cards. Really, that is what we've had before, and whilst it is nice that you can get that 200 megabits record rate in H.264 or about 130 in H.265, that really is not going to be getting the benefit out of this new camera and sensor. That comes in the Cine model, which has that 1 terabyte of built-in storage, which you get about 940 gig of, and you're able to record in that ProRes HQ. Now, it is a strange choice of codec, in my opinion. We would have much preferred to see something like ProRes LT or one of the others. I'm guessing this is a license restriction, but it is nonetheless an improvement over what we've seen before. To give you an idea from DJI's numbers, it should take about 400 megabytes a second of data rate, which should be about 27 gigs for 10 minutes of footage. So the SSD will record for about the length of one battery. Now, DJI have said that they are including a high-speed connection for offloading that footage at a rate of 10 gigabits a second, but you do need to take into account that the workflow on this drone is very much going to be fly, connect the drone to your computer to offload the footage, and wait for that to happen. Unlike the models with removable SSDs or SD cards, you are having to tether the drone to your computer to actually remove that data from the onboard SSD, and that is something that you need to put into your workflow before you actually get out and about, because it isn't going to be as simple as swapping a card out. There is going to be downtime involved. Whilst most people are not going to be recording non-stop on an SSD, like I mentioned there, it is worth taking into account that all SSDs have a lifespan, and we don't know what sort of lifespan that we will see on the SSD on the Mavic 3. It's not replaceable, so when failure begins to happen, it will happen and it will then be either a repair or a replacement board. But it is something that you may want to take into account for long-term thoughts when you are going to be using this extensively. I do feel the way they've done this just feels a bit strange, and personally I would have preferred a larger aircraft with a removable SSD rather than that built-in one and then being restricted to actually having to connect it to the computer to actually download the footage. It's a contradiction because many pro users, that workflow won't work, yet they're giving you pro level features. So it is something that many people might go out and buy the Cine model and want to take advantage of, but just understand the limitations of the workflow as well. So really, that was the points I just wanted to bring up around some of my thoughts. Now, up front, I have to say there is so much that hasn't been covered on this drone yet, and a lot of this is because the software isn't actually ready. I was astonished to just see how much was missing in many of the reviews. There's no active track, there's no smart shots, and a number of the reviews out and out said they've been limited in what they could do, and I don't fully understand how DJI have got themselves in this position where they've released a product that really isn't ready yet. It's actually quite unlike them of recent times. Most of the time, yes, there might be the odd feature missing, but not like this. There is talk of this new drone being a whole new platform and maybe even custom DJI silicon for the image processing, but we've not seen evidence of that yet, and it is possible that is part of the problem because they're having to basically start from scratch with their software development. Although there is nothing to say that is the case, and it could simply be that they are finding it harder than in previous years to be able to bring everything over. But these are bread and butter features, things like POI and things that we've had on drones such as the Phantom 3 for many, many years. I am personally very conflicted about this new model. I will love to give it a try when I get my hands on one. However, I really don't find myself running out to want to upgrade. Yes, this new camera sensor looks very nice, but I would have much preferred to have had a proper 1-inch camera with no limitations and maybe 400 megabits recording on SD card than this larger sensor that's quite restricted on the standard model, and the Cine model gets the benefit of it, but again, that workflow isn't ideal either. For me, I just don't fully understand who this drone is for. That dual camera setup is a lot of engineering for very few people's benefits, especially with the results that we've seen so far. And there are just a number of things that don't feel like they would have made sense properly at the design point, but they've continued to push ahead. I can't wait to see how the new upgraded active track looks, because it shouldn't be overlooked that there is an all new object avoidance system on this drone with all-round sensing. There's improvements to all of the software features, so there is still going to be a lot here that is very, very interesting, but we are now at the stage where this is very much like upgrading your iPhone. The tech has been stable since this drone released, and what you're getting isn't massive differences. However, they are coming at a high price. I was surprised at the increase in cost on this drone, and whilst I was expecting drones to come up more because of the recent chip shortage as well as other things, I am shocked it is quite as expensive as it is. And I do wonder how many people, especially those who own the Mavic 2, will be happy with the upgrade when you're sitting there thinking you spent all this money and it almost looks the same. The Cine model does bring a huge amount to the table though, and it is pushing things ahead unlike we've seen anywhere else. There is no question having a small portable drone with ProRes with an onboard SSD will be extremely exciting to a number of people. And for those who want that, you are going to love it. However, I don't see pro users jumping off their Inspire 2s to have it because of the fact it doesn't have that interchangeable lens, as well as the focal length isn't going to be ideal for everyone either, and the workflow is going to be a pain point too. In the end, DJI have delivered what I think will end up being a very, very good drone when we do finally get the software updates, but it does feel a little lost in the directions it was going in development, and I just don't fully understand personally why some things ended up as they would have, and I would have thought it would have been steered slightly differently. I will try and get my hands on one as soon as I possibly can, and I am really looking forward to trying it. I am in winter here in the UK, so frankly, I'm not in any particular rush. It isn't a product that I'm going to rush out to get one to do a review on because there are thousands of those reviews out there already. I would love to get my hands on it and give you my honest thoughts having flown it, and that is something I want to make happen. I'd love to play with it and try all of these new features as well, but I won't be getting my hands on the Cine one unless something dramatic happens. If I do, it will most likely be the standard one, and again, I already think I might be really finding it hard to find the biggest benefits for this one other than the improvements around the object sensing and things like that. Now, that's it from me. If you have found this video interesting and you want to support the channel, maybe to even go and buy a Mavic 3, please do consider hitting the subscribe button, and don't forget to hit the little bell next to it as well. If you'd like to support us via Patreon to allow us to keep buying gear, there is a link to it in the description, as well as a link to buy me a coffee as well. Finally, if you're interested in joining my Discord server, there is a link to that in the description of this video too. If you want to come over and say hi or even ask some questions, I'm on there, so please do check it out, and I look forward to seeing you.